Welcome back to the Invested podcast. I'm thrilled to have my friend Bradley Tusk back with me on Invested for a second time. In this conversation, Bradley and I are going to explore both the threats to democracy and the intersection of technology and democracy, how public policy, regulation influences the advent of technology, what technology can do to both help government and perhaps help center the population and make politics far less polarized. It's a fascinating conversation that I've had with Bradley many times, and I think you'll find it super interesting. We cover a lot of ground on these topics, and these are complicated topics, so I encourage you to listen in. Welcome back to the Invested podcast. I have a return guest. It is my second time having my good friend Bradley Tusk on Invested. Welcome, Bradley.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me.
If you haven't listened to our first episode, I encourage you to go listen to it. I'm not going to let Bradley introduce himself again. I'll just tell you the following about him. The guy is the single best fixer of regulation, even has a book by that name called The Fixer, was involved with Uber, and he understands how innovation interacts with the regulatory environment in a way that just about nobody else does. But today what we're going to get to actually has to do with a book he recently published called Vote with Your Phone, Why Mobile Voting is Our Final Shot at Saving Democracy. And the way I want to frame this is I think we all believe in this podcast is a lot about investing and values. We all believe that democracy, free speech, and the things we hold near and dear to us are critical for a functioning society, for an innovation economy. And it's Bradley's view, which I have a lot of sympathy for, we're going to explore today, that democracy itself is currently at risk. But he has a unique insight on why it's at risk. So before we dig into the book, I'd like to kind of talk through why it is that you think, Bradley, democracy itself is at risk.
Sure. So at least from a U.S. perspective, and while I won't go through my bio, I will say I've worked in the U.S. in city government. I was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager. I've worked in state government. I was the deputy governor of Illinois. I've worked in the federal government. I was Chuck Schumer's communications director. So I've seen this from every angle, legislative, executive, every level. I'm a lawyer, so I get the judicial piece. And the 30-odd years now that I've been in or around politics has taught me one thing. Every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. And why? These are generally desperately insecure, self-loathing people that can't live without the validation of holding office. There's a hole in their psyche, and that hole is only filled by being somebody. And most of them don't have the talent to do what you've done in all of these different ways in the private sector and the nonprofit sector, have a really successful career. They can only have it by winning elections. And so in the US, because we have gerrymandering, which means election districts are drawn by politicians to guarantee that the winner of the general election will either be a Republican or a Democrat, typically the only election that really matters in the US is the primary. And primary turnout tends to be usually around 10 to 15%. So who are those voters? They are the furthest left, or they are the furthest right, or they are big special interests that know how to move money and votes in low turnout primaries, whether it's the NRA on the right or the teachers unions on the left. And so as a result, our politicians do what they say. Because in a perfect world, they'd rather kids not get shot at school. In a perfect world, they'd rather not sort of destroy our schools just for the benefit of the teachers unions. But if they have to choose between their own political survival and the well-being of people, they're going to pick themselves every single time. And kind of that's what got me to the conclusion that I know we're going to talk about a lot today in mobile voting, which is you're never going to make them better people, right? My guess is this was true of the same personality type in the Greek Senate, in the Roman Senate. Obviously, there are a lot of parallels right now in Israel to a lot of this. We see this playing out in very similar ways. And just saying, why can't they be different? Why can't they be better? It is pointless. It accomplishes nothing. You've got to align the broader public's policy needs and incentives with the underlying politicians' political incentives. When the two things are aligned, they will work with the other side, compromise, and get things done. And when it is set up the way that we have it right now, all you get is either extreme polarization or you just get totally one-sided government. So Washington is totally dysfunctional. If you look at the state and local level, the state of Texas is wildly far right. The city of San Francisco is wildly far left, and neither of those are good either.
So I have a friend who's an economist who likes to say that tell me what the KPI is, and tell you what the outcome is. And he says that the KPI for politicians is getting reelected. And therefore, that's in fact the goal. But do you think that there's like 465 people in the House of Representatives? There's another 100 in the Senate in the United States. And there's 120 members of Knesset here. And I don't know how many members of Parliament in the UK and Germany. Like, none of these guys are in it for the public interest and for doing good. It's all cynical.
No,
I've got no self.
I would say not none of it, like maybe 5%. So like I said, I worked for Mike Bloomberg when he was mayor at City Hall. I was his campaign manager when he ran for mayor. Mike certainly was someone who did what he thought was right and didn't worry about the consequences of doing so. But look, Mike also came into office with billions of dollars and, had an advantage that other people didn't have. You're raising your finger if you want to jump in.
Yeah, so that's what I want to ask, which is it a problem of career politicians versus people who have accomplished something in the private sector before that? Is it inevitable because of the office? Like if Mike Bloomberg lost, which eventually, he didn't lose, he got, termed out.
Yeah.
He went back to business and it was okay, right? And my sense is like Mike Gallagher just left the House right now and he went into private business. I don't know him for what it's worth.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if this is like inherent in the office or it's just a path people take today.
No, because there's a lot of people like John Corzine was the governor of New Jersey, U.S. Senator. He had been the CEO of Goldman before that. He turned out to be a typical politician. Mark Warner is a U.S. Senator for Virginia. Smart guy, but a politician through and through. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, made a bunch of money in the private sector first. So, no, I think Mike was just unique in that, one, he was much richer than all of these guys. And two, city government is designed a little better to be able to be a little less ideological and political because the job is really operational, right? Are the lights turning from green to red? Is clean water running through the taps? Are the sidewalks filled with trash or not? So it was set up the right way. But there are also, so I think, as you know, my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, is in the House of Representatives. Josh Gottheimer, I think he's been probably the most pro-Israel member of Congress or right up there. And Josh definitely does try to do what's right. There's no question about it. But I will say, Josh is also very fortunate. He is in one of the remaining 25 swing districts left in the House. He represents a suburban New Jersey district, kind of right over the GW Bridge. And as a result, he is incentivized and even rewarded by his constituents for working with Republicans, working with everybody across the spectrum, compromising, getting things done. So Josh has been a highly effective member of Congress, but the freedom that he has to operate and to sort of work across the spectrum is what every member should have. They're never going to have that when primary turnout is 10% and the district is already gerrymandered. Josh's is not. Again, it's one of 25. But if primary turnout were, say, 30, 40, 50%, then all of a sudden things move to the middle. So do you remember when Amazon wanted to put their second headquarters in Queens?
I do.
So based on the polling, the city as a whole dramatically for it. The district as a whole, so this was Long Island City, so right across the water, dramatically for it. But the state senator, Mike Gianaris, who's neither inherently good nor evil, he's just a politician, looked at his primary and said, okay, turnout of probably about 10%. And when AOC came out against it, he said, oh no, if I support this deal, I'm going to get a left-wing challenger. And the people who actually show up to vote in my primary are crazy left-wing activists who do whatever AOC says. And I'm going to lose my seat. And so Mike had a choice, 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers or one job, his own. And he picked the one. He picked himself. But if primary turnout in his district were typically, say, 30% instead of 10%, just based on that, not Mike being a different person or a better person or anything else, he would have been for the deal simply because he would have lost his next primary had he opposed it, right? So, if you move things more to the middle, then all of a sudden, reasonable people can get around the table and get things done. But we're in a system right now that makes it impossible.
So I want to go back to that because one of the things you said earlier was in the primaries, so only the really ideological voters turn out, or the special interest groups went out, either because of money or it's there people that turn up for the primaries. You mentioned the teachers union. But, we do see in Washington in particular, people like now the tech lobby has turned up and obviously the tobacco lobby and others who I guess, are more mainstream voters on some level, or represent a larger swath of the voters than just the ideological people on the fringes. Like, why isn't Amazon investing in this primary generis or AOC and kind of being in there to get it done?
So Amazon one dramatically misplayed this. Like if you were to write a Harvard business case study on political malpractice and negligence, Amazon and their headquarters in Queens would be a perfect example of it. So one is they just screwed up, as did Andrew Cuomo, who was governor at the time, as did Bill de Blasio, who was New York City mayor at the time. But ultimately, if you are Amazon or Meta or Google or Microsoft or Apple or whatever it is, you like things the way they are. So take Section 230. So as you know, and the listeners may know, Section 230 is a provision in U.S. law that says internet service providers cannot be responsible for the content posted by their users on their platforms, right? So if I defame you on Instagram, you can sue me. The deep pockets would be Meta, and you can't touch Meta, right? That is an immunity that no one else in the media has, no one else in society has. And it has given the platforms a perverse incentive to promote the most negative content possible, because we know just from evolution, humans have a negativity bias. It's what kept us from being eaten by lions back in the day. And we are just more likely to click on negative headlines than positive headlines. If you're Facebook, if you're Meta, your earnings are based on clicks. It's based on advertising revenue. And so you want as many clicks as possible. You want the most negative content possible out there because that generates the most clicks. And because you are legally protected from any liability, no matter what harm happens on your platform, including mass teenage suicides, depression, child pornography. Look, we saw Pavel Durov, the CEO of Telegram, arrested in France last week over some of this stuff. Your only perverse incentive is to allow all that to happen simply because it makes you more money. Right now, because if you're Meta, you have so many lobbyists in Washington, even though most politicians from both parties will say we should repeal Section 230 to protect kids on the internet, you've been able to completely prevent that from happening. So ultimately, the big powers, whether it's giant tech companies or pharma or tobacco or the gun lobbyists or giant unions, and this is true across the spectrum, right? This is not left or right. They like things the way they are.
Segueing for a second, do you worry about the approach of the UK government to arresting people for tweeting things on Twitter? Or do you say, no, Section 230 ought to be repealed anyway, and that Twitter shouldn't have immunity for that, so we got to do something?
Well, interestingly, if you were to revoke Section 230, and in Europe, so the EU, which is the UK is no longer part of, has the Digital Markets Act, which does have a lot more regulation around this. Then all of a sudden, you actually wouldn't have the need to arrest people for tweeting. And look, if people are tweeting child pornography, they absolutely should be, right? But overall, what you need to do, it's a lot like the whole point we were just making on mobile voting. When the platform's economic incentives are aligned with the public good, that will result in the right policy. So if Twitter says, oh no, someone can now take me to court and I could be liable for a multi-billion-dollar judgment, that's what will change their behavior. They will block the tweet that they think creates a liability. And so you won't even get to the point of needing to arrest the individual because you'll finally have true content moderation. If you think about, Michael, when you were a kid, the tobacco litigation in the 1980s is one of the really big things that changed smoking in the U.S. The tobacco companies started being held liable by juries for multi-billion-dollar, tens of billions of dollars judgments. And that finally incentivized tobacco to change their advertising, change their marketing, change their retail strategy, and ultimately led to a giant decline of cigarette smoking in the U.S. So we know that strategy can work, but we can't keep letting the companies get away with having this immunity.
But I'm glad you said that, because that actually brings me to exactly where I wanted, which is the question is whether that's doable in a highly polarized political landscape right now, right? Because in the highly polarized landscape right now, I'll take Elon Musk's view of it for a second, which is Keir Starmer in the UK is a radical leftist. He's protecting Islamist immigrants and not dealing with that issue, and he's shutting the mouths of those who want to protest against it. That's probably one side of it. And I'm sure that Starmer, for his point of view, says, oh, this Musk guy is a radical free speech absolutist. And to the point you make, unless we kind of rein that in, we're not going to do it. But who's going to make that decision? If I got, so to speak, the guy perceived as the left guy, the radical left guy in Starbucks doing this, I'll get to a different place on what's controlled speech or, what's controlled smoking in a media landscape than I would otherwise. So it's hard to implement this in a polarized landscape. And technology, by the way, just to make the last point, is actually the truest expression of this. Why is it the truest expression of it? Because everybody's got a soapbox. I mean, look at me. I'm standing in front of a microphone. You're sitting in front of a microphone. I'm a nobody. You're a somebody. And, but I got a soapbox that thousands or so people are listening to. Who the hell was Michael Eisenberg before that? So, it's, anybody's got the soapbox. So what are you going to do? Let Starmer do it over here? Or then, if you go, whatever it is, what's his name? And Bolsonaro or whatever it is would do it in Brazil. Lula, whatever, yeah.
They flip back and forth there. Look, there's 2 points here that are worth thinking about. The first is the underlying nature of regulation, right? And I think one of the big problems we have in the U.S., right, this is probably true all over the world, is you have people who are career bureaucrats, academics, politicians, policymakers who have never had a P&L, never created a job, never really worked in the private sector. You have career tech people who have either been founders or VCs or others who are very smart and have made a lot of money, but have never worked in government, never worked in politics, don't really understand how that happened. And they have these extremist views on both sides that don't make sense, right? So if you take, for example, the California AI bill that passed on Friday, this will run a couple weeks from now, but at the end of August, it puts basic safety testing and regulations around large language models. I would argue that it is a totally reasonable bill. Mark Andreessen, who has kind of become the leader of sort of the libertarian tech optimist manifesto concept, is against it, as is, by the way, OpenAI, Meta, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, everyone else, because they're saying, no, we can't have any regulation of technology at all because it will stifle innovation. Living in a world with no rules and regulation at all, it is not a feasible way to live. Human beings need a certain amount of structure. If you go all the way back to the beginning of the human species, there were Homo sapiens and there were Neanderthals, right? And the Neanderthals, as I understand it, were not only bigger and stronger, they were actually smarter too. Their brains were a lot bigger, but what they couldn't do was work together. They couldn't compromise. They couldn't create any sort of society. And as a result, even though Homo sapiens were less impressive on an individualistic level, on a collective level, much more impressive. And in the war between the species, we won out, and that's what developed. Mark Andreessen would not like living in a world of total chaos, right? Mark Andreessen has the billions of dollars that he has and the security to walk around, Menlo Park or San Francisco, wherever it is, generally safely, because we have a society with structure. So to say we should be absolutists and there should be no rules on speech or no regulation on tech or anything else, that's absurd. At the same time, the FTC, so take Lina Khan, right? I would say that her view in trying to make sure that the giant tech companies don't have monopolistic power over the marketplace is very pro-innovation because it's what helps allow for early stage competitors to emerge and challenge some of the big companies. On the flip side, Khan seems to think that all M&A activity is bad, right? And her general antithesis, or kind of just antipathy towards mergers and acquisitions has created this massive chilling effect across tech, where the vast majority of tech exits are not IPOs, they're M&A deals, and companies, and I'm sure you have this conversations in board meetings, I certainly do, deals that would have been discussed and pursued a couple of years ago are now just shot down immediately. So because, the FTC will never allow that. And even things that probably wouldn't have to go before the FTC are now not happening. And what does that lead to? There's been a lot less venture investment over the last couple of years than prior. And that means less new company formation, less new company success, less innovation. Lina Khan is a career academic. She's only ever worked in either academia or government. She has never created a single job in her life, and she has no ideas. The problem is when we have a world where everyone are sort of policy extremists, whether it's Mark Andreessen on one side or Lina Khan on the other, and instead of looking at regulation and saying a regulation is neither inherently good nor bad, it is as good or bad as it applies to the context and situation that we're in. That's it. But when you don't look at it that way, you're going to get these really polarized, disparate results. And the only way to take away the power of a Lena Khan on the far left, or Mark Andreessen now on the right, is to move things back to the middle. And that's where technology can be an incredible solution, because we live in a world right now in the US where the whole system of voting is designed to keep people from voting, right? If you're in power, you don't want more turnout because you know how to win low turnout primaries. So you're not interested in changing that. When I was in law school, I had a professor guy named Abner Mikva, and Mikva had been Clinton's White House counsel. He had been a federal appellate court judge. Incredible guy. I caught him at the very end of his career, where he would basically just tell stories. And he told this story when he started off in politics, that this was like the 1950s, and Adlai Stevenson was running against Dwight Eisenhower for president. And he was a young guy, and he wanted to volunteer for Stevenson. And he walks into one of the local ward offices in Chicago, and the ward boss, guy named O'Sullivan or something like that, smoking a cigar, is saying, "What do you want?" He said, "Oh, I want a volunteer. I want to help." And O'Sullivan says, "Who sent you?" And Mikva says, "Nobody." He goes, "We don't want nobody. Nobody sent." That's ultimately still how it is today, right? And so even though, yes, in theory, everyone over the age 18 could arrange to go vote, the vast majority of us don't. But 90% of American adults at this point have a smartphone. By the 2026, 97% of Gen Z will have a smartphone. And if you met them where they are and said, look, all you got to do now is pull up an app and vote securely in an encrypted way on your phone, that's what gets the kind of participation and primary turnout up that cancels out the undue influence that Lena Khan has on the left or Mark Andreessen has on the right, and it moves things to the middle.
So before we dig into the exact mechanisms of mobile voting and your theory as to why this works, and I'll just state that you already said that because there's 100% almost accessibility to a mobile phone, and we send things to people's mobile phones, and therefore we can kind of notify them to make sure that they vote. You have two unstated assumptions in there. One is that, so to speak, wisdom of the crowds will bring people to the center. That is an assumption. The second assumption that you make is that technology, being the blank slate that it is, in this case, the mobile phone or a mobile voting app, won't be subject to the same manipulation. I'm not even talking about nefariousness at this point. I was talking about, influences, et cetera, before we get to the nefarious, the hacking, whatever it is. Influences, et cetera, that we just talked about on social media platforms like Meta and X and others occur there, and AI that occur there. And so you have what I would call two big assumptions elephants in the room that we need to talk about.
Let's go through that. So on the first one, I think it's a math question, which is definitionally the view of 30%, 40%, 50% is inherently more mainstream than the view of 10%. Now, we may not like the view of the 40% or 50%. I would consider myself a centrist, but I have views that are in line with the far right. I have views that are in line with the far left. Not every view that I hold is going to be advanced by mobile voting, but definitionally, if democracy is the expression of the most number of people saying, here's what I believe, and you're trying to effectuate that, higher turnout inherently represents that, right? Or let me give you a more sort of basic example. This is one that, you were kind of watching because you were, in Uber for Benchmark, and I was running these campaigns. So let's just take taxi and Uber, which is, by the way, I literally came up with the whole mobile voting concept in the middle of doing this work for Uber. So normally speaking, pre-Uber, pre-us, taxi, you're a taxi medallion owner in Atlanta, I'm making up any city, right? You give your local city councilman $4,000 every campaign cycle, and they do what you want because they want the $4,000 for the next campaign, right? All of a sudden, we just, after you at their behest tried to shut us down, had 5,000 of your constituents text, tweet, email, call, express through technology in some way, hey, leave this Uber thing alone. I like it. We shifted the underlying inputs, and all of a sudden, the views of the 5,000 constituents dramatically outweighed the $4,000 from the taxi owner. And that's what allowed Uber to win and to be legal in every single market in the U.S. I think we would agree that the country is far better off for having Uber, having ride sharing, better options for consumers, more jobs for drivers, less drunk driving. There's so many positive externalities to Uber, right? And so what that said to me is people, if you make it easy enough for them, they will express their will, but they're only going to do it if you make it easy enough. Your average person is not missing taking their kid to school or being late for work on a random Tuesday to vote in a city council primary, state senate primary. And yet they should still have the ability to be heard. And so, yes, I am taking the basic democratic view that more people is more reflective of the mainstream. And look, more people in the U.S. at this point are independents than Republicans or Democrats. And what do independents want? They just want shit to get done, right? They kind of hate both parties. They hate both extremes. Most of these issues are transgender bathrooms or pronouns or whatever, however it is on either side. They don't want to deal with any of that, right? They just want well-run, safe, effective government. And if those people all of a sudden were empowered, that would become the underlying incentives for our politicians. So that's why, to me, the first assumption is a safe one. The second one is, what about all the misinformation that currently happens on social media and the risk of AI doing that? Sure. I don't think that mobile voting makes that risk any greater or any less. But to me, right now, we have a system that is in the toilet and doomed to stay in the toilet, because whenever you have 10% turnout, we know for a fact that everything is controlled by the extremes and by a handful of special interests. If all of a sudden it moves to 30, 40, 50%, inherently that diffuses the power of those special interests, right? So fundamentally, the NRA may want to put messaging on Facebook to say, they're going to come for your guns and they're going to kill you along your homes and whatever else. When turnout's 12% in a Republican congressional primary and half those people are NRA members, the NRA's vote share in that election is 50%. When turnout becomes 36% in that same primary, the NRA vote share goes down to 16%. So the people, if anything, if we have higher turnout, the people putting out misinformation, their share of the electorate goes way down and their ability to influence it goes down commensurately.
Let me take the other side of this argument for a second. I'm not sure what I think, but I want to take the other side of the argument, because what we're at right now is what I would call the intersection of technology and values. That's really what we're at. So my assumption is at some point, democracy worked better than it did today, because it's a system that's lasted for a couple hundred years, feels like it's coming off the rails. At some point, it worked better. Number one, in the past, most of these candidates were decided in smoke-filled rooms by guys jumping on cigars. There wasn't a lot of representation, clearly, of women in those places, and certainly not people of color in the United States or whatever it is. It was a much less diverse crowd, but democracy, at least the way we thought of it, worked better. By the way, not everyone had the right to vote at some point in time, but it worked better. And that's kind of, I think, one part of it that we ought to be aware of, which is somehow we think it worked better in the past, but it didn't include what today we consider to be modern values or democratic values. So that's kind of point one I'd like for you to consider. Point two I'd like for you to consider is the following. Mobile phones, whether in people's hands and pockets and kind of, coming at you all the time, that's actually the easiest place to influence people to do really stupid stuff. To click on things, these ad networks are incredibly powerful. People were concerned about Cambridge Analytica, and that was before you'd have an instant click to go vote for your candidate, which is what you're advocating right now. The retweet problem, which is I see something, I got to retweet it right now without pausing for a second, is a real problem. And so the more instantaneous something is, the more fast-paced something is, the more it's in your hand, the more the ability is to kind of at a mass scale move people. So maybe it's plausible that we actually get more polarized societies because of the nature of the medium, because the medium is the message rather than the outcome that you're hoping for, which is, hey, people will be who they are. And, most people are more towards the center.
Yeah, I mean, so a few things. One, that's a definitely very Marshall McLuhan type kind of perspective on the medium being the message. And it's certainly been around for a while. It has validity to it. But first of all, I've spent over 30 years now in and around politics, elections, government, all of that. Yes, there are things that will influence voters in one direction or another, but overall, they're pretty true to who they are, right? And they kind of care about their pocketbook, their safety, their kids' schools. Like New York City, where you grew up, where I live, we're going to have a mayoral election next year. And fundamentally, it's going to be based on, does the incumbent Eric Adams get reelected or not? That's going to be, do people feel safe? Do they feel like the city is clean and well run? Do they like living here? And that's fundamentally what it's going to be, not sort of different TikTok videos one way or the other. So number one is
how do you know that? You say that with authority. I'm not persuaded you actually know that.
Because of decades of polling, focus groups, talking to voters, running campaigns, going to campaign events, just a life's worth of experience.
I'll take the other side of it again, because I think the conversation. So nobody ever know that they had to do 10,000 steps a day and get up in the middle of the night to walk up and down the staircase until they put a Fitbit on somebody's arm. So digitally induced behavior is like a real thing. And people do crazy stuff to hit 10,000 steps a day, whatever the case may be, because there's kind of digital reminders over there. So perhaps you're incorrect.
Let's look at where we are. Just take New York City. Let's stick with that, right? So we have the city council last year, primary turnout was 6.5%, right?
Yeah.
So you could win a city council seat in New York City with 6, 7, 8,000 votes in a city of 8.5 million people in the, I would argue, best and most important city in the world.
That's horrific. We can agree that that's horrific.
And so who are those people? Radical left wing. So the city council, after failing to defund the police, passed a bill last year that said, every time a police officer interacts with anyone from the public in any way, even give someone directions, they have to file a report. What is that an attempt to do? It's a backdoor way to defund the police by saying we're going to tie them up so much with paperwork that they can't do their actual job of policing. The mayor vetoed the bill. His veto was overridden. Why? Because if you are a city council member with 6.5% turnout, the logical decision to make, if your only goal is re-election, is to support that bill, because that's what that 6.5% wants. Right now, we have a city that feels dirty, feels dangerous. We have thousands of unlicensed weed shops. We have scaffolding everywhere. We have mentally ill homeless people on fentanyl everywhere. We have people riding their bikes on the sidewalks and running down the bike lanes and all of that, because there's a true feeling of lawlessness in the city. That is the result of progressive left-wing policies driven by incredibly low turnout in the primaries. We know that what we have doesn't work. What you're saying is, well, if we try this and we're at 46.5% instead of 6.5%, maybe it won't be different or better. So a lifetime of experience tells me that that's wrong, that it will be better. But even if not, it can't be worse than we have right now. And so right now we're heading on a collision course. And you and I discussed this before. I don't think we're even one country in 25 years. If we don't make some sort of massive fundamental reform to the way that we elect people and incentivize them to work together. And so to me, we're at the point where we've got to try something inherently different. And again, also just to be clear, I'm not advocating for replacing all other forms of voting with your phone. It's just an additional option. We would still have vote by mail. We would still have voting machines. Everyone can still do it the way that they want to do it. We're just saying, here's another way to do it.
Do you think that mobile voting will discount the views of older populations at the expense of Gen Z people, maybe?
I think right now the views of older populations are wildly inflated and way too influential, right? We frequently screw over. Think about all the spending that we do, right? We just take on more and more and more debt and say, in order to have things better today, we're going to saddle our kids and our grandkids with a debt that can never be paid and that eats up the interest payments alone, more and more and more of the annual budget. And they're going to have to make do with less healthcare, less education, less resources, smaller military, all of that, because we are unwilling to make any sacrifices today. Our government is wildly inflated towards the elderly because they are the people that vote right now. If anything, we should be looking to decrease their influence and look out for the views of the future. And one more piece, though, which is we also need reform of social media, right? The TikTok ban in the U.S. was outstanding, right? And that should be, I hope, upheld by the courts. We need to revoke Section 230. You saw over 800 different bills on AI introduced in state governments last year. A quarter of them were around things like deep fakes and misinformation and elections. And all of those need to move forward. A lot of those need to move forward. So yes, we need to make voting vastly more accessible because we can't keep going the way we are. But yes, we also need to radically reform the use of AI and social media to protect people.
Those are all big holes to do at once. I'm obviously a huge fan of the TikTok bill. I think it's a nefarious force of a communist government on the other side of the world trying to undermine the United States and all free societies, by the way.
Yep.
And you see the data from NCRI, Network and Data Research Institute, is absolutely clear that they suppress anti-China material. It's absolutely clear that they pump up pro-Hamas material. It's absolutely clear that when you compare it to Instagram or other places, there's a lot more undermining of the United States and patriotism than any other platform. And so I'm a big fan of that ban. That having been said, I think your point of like this moving more voting power, so to speak, which is moving more policies to the younger population versus the older population, I can argue the opposite. So I'll take it for a second.
Sure.
Not because I don't think we have to invest in the future and that we have inflated spending for large parts of the population, but these are people who take responsibility and go out to vote.
Yep.
Right? And you want a society of responsible citizens. One of the things that living in Israel has taught me is that this is a society of mostly responsible citizens. And we have responsible citizens. You have much more civic activism. You have higher voter turnouts, like 70+% here. And you end up, we have our own polarization, but it's not nearly as bad as the United States right now. And so what you're doing is, I would call it a hack, which is a values judgment, to move power from people who've taken responsibility to go vote to those who can't be bothered to go vote by making it easier for them. And so can we agree it's a values judgment and not just...
Sure, it's a values judgment, but at the same time, if you fundamentally believe in democracy and you believe that everyone should have the ability to vote, and you now have a medium through technology to make it dramatically easier to vote. Like, think about what you and I do in our day jobs at VCs. We're looking for, can we reduce friction meaningfully enough to incentivize consumer behavior or business behavior in some way to buy the product or service of the startup we invest in, right? Fundamentally, that's what our job is about. If we have a way to dramatically reduce the friction of voting, I would argue we have a moral obligation to do so, right? We should do everything we can to make voting as easy and accessible as possible. And keep in mind, forget about just regular people like you and me. Imagine if you were blind, right? One of our biggest groups of support is National Federation for the Blind. Not only do you have, it's so much harder for you as a blind person to go somewhere to have to vote, you then have to rely on the person you're dealing with at the polling place to actually cast the ballot in the way that you want them to, right? You have no privacy at all. You're a deployed military. You mail in your ballot from Kandahar. It shows up 3 weeks after the election. It goes in the trash, right? You are a Native American living on a tribal land, and you have a 150-mile drive to the nearest polling place. It's not going to happen. You live in Alaska. You got to get in a bush plane. It's not going to happen. There are so many different college students. There's so many communities. Forget about that we're saying, are you responsible enough or not to make the effort? There are some people for whom just the ability to even make the effort isn't there in the first place.
Listen, I certainly have no question about the military, that they need to be able to vote early and vote often, as far as I'm concerned. I do think, though, this is not my perspective. If I was challenging it, I would say that having responsible citizens versus all citizens is an interesting values question, and one I would take seriously. But I want to switch to something.
Which is, if you could show that the roughly 10% of Americans who reliably vote in primaries were the responsible citizens leading to a effective, well-functioning democracy, sure, right? But we have the opposite of that, right? We have a totally polarized, dysfunctional, broken democracy. And so, like, the very prima facie evidence of the world that we live in our country, it's different than your country, but that we have in our country, argues that the responsible citizen sort of thesis just doesn't work.
I want to switch gears for half a second, because you talked a lot about reducing friction. You talk a lot about speed and accessibility, et cetera. One of the other hot topics that you and I have spoken about a lot, and I spent a lot of time thinking about here as well, is purchasing. right, is how the government purchases things.
Yeah.
It was obviously a big problem that was well publicized in the military probably 20 years ago, the $400 hammer or whatever it was. And very clearly, as the world has sped up, government purchasing, procurement has not sped up.
Yeah.
And it's still very, very bureaucratic. And in general, I've made the comment many times that civic society runs on WhatsApp and iOS, whereas the government still runs on Windows 95. If we're lucky, it might still run on the Pony Express.
Yeah.
And so I'm super interested, as you think about mobile voting, which is what we call a technological advance that perhaps, in your view, changes the nature of democracy. What would you do in procurement in particular?
Yeah, I'm trying to put something in the chat as we speak. So I wrote a Substack. Where we post it? Maybe it's here. About 2 weeks ago, that talked about how you could use AI to start performing government functions itself. So there's a little bit of a shift in topic from mobile voting, but I believe that AI could radically improve government procurement. Right. So the example that I used in the Substack, but it was just an example, was the disastrous rollout of legalized cannabis in New York, right? So when you come home to see family or to do business here, you have undoubtedly noticed the thousands of illegal weed shops all over the city, which has caused a massive crisis in terms of teenage addiction and lawless behavior and everything else. The process of writing the actual regulations. So the New York State Legislature wrote legislation to say, okay, cannabis will now be recreationally legal. Fine. That's a very human process and is the result of give and take of different people from different parties, different parts of the state with different perspectives. Great. That is a fundamentally human process. From there, though, when they write a bill, that's just sort of the beginning. The reality is you then need to promulgate regulations for industry as to how they're going to do whatever it is. That's really where the rubber meets the road a lot in our work. It took the bureaucrats who were appointed 2.5 years to come up with the rules. And in the interim, thousands of illegal weed shops opened up. And you kind of can't blame the public for not really knowing what was legal and what wasn't legal, because they knew that the legislature had legalized cannabis. And they're supposed to know, do you have the proper licensure or not? No. How could a member of the public be expected to know that? That's unreasonable, right? And so these shops flourish. They're waiting forever for the regulations, including the regulations by which they need to have the power to shut down the illegal shops. It takes 2.5 years. And since the bill was passed in 2021, we're now over 3 years later, there are only 140 licensed dispensaries. There is somewhere an estimate of 5,000 illegal ones. I argue in this piece, and it's on my Substack, if you want to check it out, that had we used AI, we could have A, promulgated the regulations in a fraction of the time, and B, used AI to say, okay, the legislature wants these criteria taken into effect. Geography, neighborhood, background of the owner of the license applicant, preference for people who have, were military veterans or women or whatever you want it to be, right? You put the inputs into the model, you put the applications in front of it, and it would say, here is a stack ranking of all the applications based on the criteria set out by the rules of the New York State Legislature, and you could have done it in a fraction of the time that it happened. So I believe that effectively a licensing determination is just a form of government procurement. It's the same thing by a slightly different name. So whether it's how the military purchases weapons or how the transportation department purchases orange cones, or how we license nail salons or weed dispensaries or anything else, I think that you can make the process A, vastly more efficient, but B, vastly more fair and less political, right? A lot of the corruption in the system comes from the human element of it, right? People either literally taking bribes, or most of the time it's more soft corruption, which is this vendor took me out for my birthday. I was getting married and took me to a strip club for my bachelor party, whatever it is. And then all of a sudden, you're favoring them in RFP applications. I've got an investment we led the Series A of a company earlier this year in the education space, where we have to win all of our contracts through RFP. And we've won a bunch, but we've lost 2 this year that I literally can't come up with any explanation other than corruption for how we lost them, because nothing else actually makes sense. If we had AI making determinations with some level of human review or override, just like we should have that That's the point of the California regulation we talked about earlier. I really do think that you could dramatically transform the way that procurement works. So, I haven't seen any startups yet focused on building AI procurement systems for government, maybe because it's just most people in tech don't come out of the government and think about it this way. But I do think that it could be an incredibly powerful tool, and I think existing tools could be used for that purpose too.
I was sitting here listening to, and you talked about how, AI procurement, it would help the system, make it more objective. And then you said maybe somebody would override on it, and I began to scratch my head and go, oh, wait a minute. Maybe then it becomes a CYA, the AI for people to make decisions.
Yeah. I don't know.
They want to make it anyway. And
Yes.
people are people. And I try to figure out for myself, like, where do you say, like, people are people? Where do you say, like, oh, we need technology innovation here? And I come back to mobile voting again, which is like, here, we need to make it super frictionless, to get in front of the people to let them vote. When it comes to AI and just automating the machine, you say, oh, I will automate it, but then what the guy override it? And it's just not clear to me where you draw the line in all these things. Do you do that?
With mobile voting, we have built, ultimately, you have election officials who are human beings who are either elected themselves or appointed by elected officials who would have not the ability, obviously, to change your vote, but, ultimately, they have the ability to audit everything and print out paper copies of the ballot and double check, everything in our system can be the minute it hits the election office, printed out. So there is a paper copy of absolutely everything and tabulate that against the digital score. And the ability, look, election officials, so for example, in the US, voter identification. It can be as stringent as when we did mobile voting for military, we did a facial recognition scan and a biometric scan. And then once that determined you are clearly Michael Eisenberg, you were then cleared to vote. There are other places where it's just literally a signature. And if it's sort of your scribble looks like vaguely like the scribble in the book, good enough, right? That's up to each individual election official. Personally, I would love to have biometric, and we've built our system to allow for biometric because I think that would make voting more secure, just like the way Clear works at the airport. I think that we could do the same thing for mobile voting. We have built the same technology for it. But there is a level of human override in the sense that I don't get to decide what identification requirements a local jurisdiction is going to use. I just have to offer them technology that comports with whatever their rules are. But when you think about the procurement question, it's a little bit to me, like I think the American legal system is maybe not a bad model here, which is in a civil trial, you make a decision based on a preponderance of the evidence, right? In a criminal trial, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. I think something, and again, this is super early and unformed, but I think something like that where you say, if beyond a reasonable doubt, the AI got it wrong, hallucinated in some way, whatever it is, that's when the human ability to interfere comes in, and that's a legal standard that will be applied. Something like that. Look, we are in, as we would all agree, the top of the first or best the bottom of the first when it comes to AI. So there's a lot more that we don't know than we do know. But I think something like that would work. And again, for mobile voting, that's why, we have a system that is end-to-end verifiable, that is end-to-end encrypted, that allows for paper ballots to be printed out at the end of the process. And B, comports with the local rules and regulations of whatever jurisdiction we're working in. So, yeah, I do think we have it.
If I was going to make the argument against mobile voting, what's the best way to make the argument?
So if I'm a politician and I don't want mobile voting because I know how to win my current elections and I don't want to make it easier for someone to challenge me, I would say security, safety, Putin's going to hack it. Nothing is unhackable. Quantum computing can blow this out of the water. We can't take the risk. Democracy is too important. The integrity and security of democracy trumps everything else, even if that means much lower Trump, right? That's what they're going to say, because you know what they can't say? We don't want more people to vote, right? So like in Texas or Georgia, when they passed significant voting restrictions, they didn't say we don't want more black people to vote. That's what they meant. We don't want black people who tend to vote Democrat to turn out, so we're going to come up with ways to try to exclude them. They said security, integrity. So those are going to be the buzzwords that we use. And there are groups like Citizens Action, Verified Voting in the U.S., sort of very inside the beltway, super wonky ivory tower organizations where everyone went to Yale and everyone, has sharing at 5 p.m., where they don't think that stupid people should vote, and they don't want to make it easier to vote, and they will argue that we are better off in a world where only people like them, to the your responsible citizen thesis effectively, should be allowed to vote. And so that's the case they're going to make. And look, the reality is two things. One, I'm not going to, so when we're done building our tech, I think we got about another 8 to 12 months of work to do. I'm going to make it open source and free, which A, makes it totally honorable, right? B, means other people can improve on it. But C, makes it free, right? This is completely a philanthropic thing for me, a foundational technology, not even my foundation. I've given it to another foundation. But we're only going to do that once we're first certified by NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology. So until NIST says, yes, you're good to go, we think this is secure software, I'm not putting it out there in the marketplace. So one is, by definition, we're going to meet the same certifications that technology already has to. And number two, I'm not arguing that the 2024 or 2028 presidential election should be decided by mobile voting. Let's start off with city council primaries, school board elections. Let's start off with municipal elections, maybe just primaries, and work our way up. See what works, see what doesn't work. Vladimir Putin is not hacking, the New York City Council District 12 election in the Bronx, right?
It turns out he didn't need to hack the San Francisco election from the city going downhill. He did it himself.
Right. So I'm both arguing for only using the technology that we're building, one, certified by outside expertise, and then two, rolling it out in a very local, incremental way. And over time, see what doesn't work. And by the way, if the answer is we roll this out and it does more harm than good in any way, then don't do it, right? But to not try it simply because either you're worried about things that I think are somewhat impossible to predict, or you ultimately are an apologist for the status quo, is unreasonable.
Does that make you a techno-optimist like Mark Andreessen?
In that way, yes. I mean, there are ways we talked about earlier that I really disagree with Mark, because Mark would say a true techno-optimist rejects all regulation of technology in any way, shape, or form, or is a free speech absolutist. And I would say, no, Mark is wrong about that. But do I think that fundamentally, you can't have the job that you have, that I have, where we invest in early stage tech companies, and not be a techno-optimist, because fundamentally, if we didn't think that A, tech ultimately always wins, and B, that tech can make people's lives better, there would be easier ways for us to make a living, right? What we do, I would argue, is pretty risky and pretty hard. And it's because we have this underlying optimism and belief.
Okay. Before I get to two final questions, there's a question I have to ask you based on what you said about like the biometrics and checking people and voter registration, et cetera. So I think you've been a pretty vocal supporter of Kamala Harris for president. At least one of the beefs on her is that many illegals that have come into the country, she wants to allow to vote. And there's certainly been some moves made in that direction. What do you think about that?
I don't support that. But even more broadly, the United States, like most of the Western world, has a significant population problem, right? And by the way, not just Western world, China too. We are a country that is getting older and older, and older people are vastly more expensive. They use Social Security, they use Medicare. We need millions, if not tens of millions of more legal taxpayers in the U.S. filling jobs, and we have these giant holes in the industry like hospitality and nursing and construction, and paying taxes. So I would argue we need exponentially more legal immigration, but what I don't support is illegal immigration. I think we should have giant, expansions of quotas, but at the same time, much tighter border security. And when someone does come here illegally, they should be deported. They shouldn't be permitted to stay. Now, the migrants that we have, if you're not going to deport them, at least let them work, because just supporting them with taxpayer money is crazy to me. That makes the least sense of anything that you could do. But ultimately, the Democrats are wrong in saying that we just have open borders and everyone could be here. And the Republicans are wrong in saying, no, we need to keep things as tight as possible for the good of our economy and the good of our society, especially the good of elderly people. We need a lot more legal immigration, but you can't have a country without secure borders, and we should have exponentially tighter borders here.
Europe had legal immigration because of the same problem. They had a worse demographic problem than the United States did, and now I would say they are culturally challenged, to say the least. And that was with legal immigration. I think, for what it's worth, the Republican platform says there should be more high-quality immigration.
We should have both.
and less kind of call it blue collar or whatever it is. Or
well, it should be this. I mean, I would argue the Department of Labor should every year say, these are the number of openings in the workforce where the U.S. doesn't have the skill set among the current population to fill it. And we need, I'm making it up, 2 million more workers in these 6 sectors. And it could be high skill or low skill. That's what we let in, right? Like, it should be totally determined by the economic need of society, not ideological, not illegal. And that's what it should be. I mean, we should sort of almost take it out of the hands of politicians completely.
As somebody who's worried about elections being tipped, do you worry that illegals will tip this election?
No, because the reality is being able, I have worked, like I said, in politics for 30 years, and the actual examples of voter fraud compared to the concerns raised about voter fraud is like exponentially.
No, this is a voter fraud. This is, I let people aren't citizens of the United States and they come and vote, basically.
If they vote, it would be fraudulent.
Oh, no, unless you let them, right?
So, yeah, I mean, a few things. One is, typically speaking, the places that have the biggest sort of migrant problem populations are New York, California, Illinois, states where the outcome is already predetermined anyway. So, in the places where the voters really are, that risky, it's not really material. But B, more reality, voter fraud is one of the things. Look, I worked in Chicago politics for years, right? I mean, that's as bad as it gets. You have lots of corruption. But the notion of like actually people voting illegally, it's fun to put in books and movies and TV shows and all of that. It's like 0.00006% of total votes cast in American history. So I don't think it's a real life.
All right, I want to ask 2 last questions. One is about AI regulation. So you were in favor of the California regulation. I want to turn the question in a slightly different way. We're fighting a lot of asymmetric wars in the world right now, and people are fighting by different rules, right? You know, we've got the war with Hamas, terrorists fighting by one set of rules, Israel having its hands tied by, the UN, the rule of law, etc. None of us want to live in a lawless society, obviously, and the rule of law and human rights is critically important. At the end of the day, the West is currently disadvantaged in this because we're fighting under 2 different systems. It's not just war, it's also technology and AI. This very fast emerging area of technology, particularly AI. He who has less regulation will have inevitably more innovation, more ability to train models, and more ability to build the AI god, to use a term I learned from Gavin Baker. Whereas people whose hands are shackled, one way or the other, or even have to turn to the regulator, and you know how slow those processes are, could be slowed down. How does the West win a war when you're playing by 2 separate rules, and when the guys innovating need to go talk to the regulators? Whereas in China, it's like, okay, go right ahead, or in Iran,
Yeah, so it's interesting. Yes and no, right? Yes, definitionally, if you were playing by a different set of rules. And I think the problem is less around, for example, that Chinese innovators are less restricted and more that Chinese companies, the Chinese government are stealing through corporate espionage, U.S. technology, right?
They're both problematic.
Ultimately, though, the U.S. has one major competitor, and Israel was sort of exactly the same bucket in this case, over Europe and over China and the rest of the world, which is we have the right mix of an economic system, a governmental system, an academic system that really breeds innovation, right? Even with all of our problems, we are still the most innovative country in the history of the world by an exponential margin. And so clearly some of that does involve rules and regulations and everything else. But what we do need is we don't need dumb regulations around AI. The reason why I support the California bill is it's incredibly light touch. I said, look, we should have basic safety testing. We should have some sort of ability to have an emergency stop. So if we do create this sentient being that decides that all human beings are a threat to AI and have to go, we have some ability to deal with it. But to me, it's not like the construction of cars or planes. No one would argue that we should build cars or planes without any sort of safety standards or testing or regulation. None of us want to get in a car or plane like that. Having that level of basic regulation to me around AI makes a lot of sense. But again, it should be basic regulation to ensure bottom line safety, not to ultimately dictate who wins or doesn't win the market, number one. Number two, we should be spending exponentially more on government funding for R&D, both direct government research and investing and investment in academics, otherwise, to really, significantly increase it. 3, what we talked about before, immigration. One of the great advantages this country has, if you see the movie Oppenheimer, half the people worked in that bomb weren't from this country to begin with, but we brought them in, right? Starting with Einstein, right? And like the most talented people from all over the world would like to be in the U.S., bring them all in, make them American citizens. Yes, you got to worry about corporate espionage, and I'm not an expert on that. We have to deal with it, but ultimately, co-opt them. You're a Yankees fan, right? The advantage that the Yankees have always had over my bets and everyone else is they can always get the cream of the crop, right? The most talented players in baseball want to be Yankees. So Juan Soto, when it comes up for free agency this fall, my Mets will probably offer him more money than your Yankees will, simply because Steve Cohen is actually a lot richer than the Steinbrenner, right? And yet, we're probably not going to get it. You're probably going to re-sign him, even if it's for $50 million less in the scope of the total contract, because you're the Yankees, right? The U.S. is the Yankees, right? We should be just like you guys use it to get the best free agents. We should be using it to get the best scientists, the best technologists, and everything else. So it's a combination of the right regulations. No regulation is a problem, and too much regulation. Like take crypto, right? If you had a complete absence of crypto regulation, Coinbase couldn't exist. Circle couldn't exist. Lots of companies that I'm invested in, or you might be, couldn't exist simply because then you would have a point where the amount of scams would be so overwhelming that nobody could trust the market at all. People couldn't participate. So you want a certain amount of regulation to prevent fraudulent behavior, but not so much that you can't encourage innovation, right? So you need the right rules and regulation combined with heavy government investment, combined with right immigration laws.
You make it sound a little bit like it's so easy. You just got to get the right regulation. Then I come back to the example you had about the Amazon second center in Long Island City, which wasn't even about regulation, just about, hey, let's create 40,000 jobs, and they still couldn't get it right. And at the beginning, you thought that politicians are not like in it for the greater good. They're kind of KPI motivated, which is get elected, but we'll get some out of the right regulation. It feels like, alchemy.
I would say the California bill probably is the right regulation, right? And I think that if you had significantly more primary turnout in my Generis district in Queens, you would have had those Amazon jobs here. And so that if we can bring our politics to the mainstream by increasing primary turnout, meaning through secure mobile voting, and if we can harness technology like AI, where we both put basic precautions in place so that there are safety testing, but at the same time, really harness their ability for things like procurement. So not just the government regulates AI, the government uses AI for its own functionality. That's how we get there.
I want to finish with one last question, which is a thesis I have, but it came to my mind because of something you said earlier, that human beings index for bad news, which is what causes social media to promote more divisive things and more bad news and stuff like that, because we ran away from the lion and we wanted to get away from the lion. And so the thesis I have goes something like this. Religion, which is generally optimistic about the future, as a general proposition, or certainly Judaism and Christianity are optimistic about the future, as an antidote to Darwinism. Meaning Darwinism, so to speak, survival of the fittest, means one, I need to trump you, no pun intended. I need to kind of be more fit than you and defeat you. And number two, as a way to overcome this fear gene, which is so prominent in human beings because we ran away from the lions. And religion, which I know you spent some time on trying to find an application to create virtual religion, is kind of an antidote to that.
Yep.
How do you think about that? And do you think that's actually implementable online? And this is why I'm asking you the question, because I know you spent time working on trying to create online religious forums.
I did. I failed miserably at that. But look, I mean,
it's venture capital, baby.
Yeah, no, I get it. I've gotten over it. Look, all evolution cares about is adaptation, right? It just cares about survival for the sake of survival without any regard to humanity, quality of life, morality, anything else, right? So while it is an undeniable fact, it clearly can't be our governing thesis or philosophy. What I really love about Judaism, and I would say there's a big difference between Judaism and other religions, is because we don't believe in an afterlife and we don't believe in reincarnation. So that differs us from Islam, from Christianity, and from Hinduism, right? is ultimately all that really matters is the here and now. Your happiness in this world is dependent upon what kind of person you are and what kind of life you lead. And the reward for living a good life is living a good life, right? And, I think about, in a few weeks, we'll be back to school for the high holidays. What are the three ultimately antidotes to the Book of Judgment? Tzedakah, tefillah, teshuvah, right? And if you were to sort of engage in those three things, and I think daily about whether or not, I am on all three fronts there, like prayer is something that's part of my life, charity and helping other people. I do, again, because it makes me feel good about myself, right? What I have learned is when I do things that I think are societally impactful, whether it's trying to fix the box through global voting, or I carry around $10 Dunkin' Donuts gift cards in my pocket and I give to homeless people, because then that can't use the money to buy drugs or alcohol with it. That makes
they can get a lot of sugar.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I don't tell them what to eat. They want to eat donuts, it's fine. But ultimately, it's selfish, right? It makes me feel good about myself. So that's tzedakah. And then, teshuvah, ultimately, if I wrong somebody, again, so that I feel better about myself, I need to make amends. That might be as simple as an apology. It might be an apology plus me internalizing why I did what I did, so I understand, because things don't just happen for no reason, how not to do it again and what prompted my behavior, how I can adjust it going forward. And I think that, if we can focus on those three things and we could focus on being a good human being, we lead happier lives. And to me, that's the moral philosophy of Judaism, especially, that I would say, and by the way, is a big distinction, and there's obviously nothing wrong with any religion. But to me, if I were living my life in anticipation of an afterlife, I think my life here on earth would be far less meaningful, far less purposeful, and far less rich and fulfilling. And so that's how I fundamentally think about it. And I think religion is fundamentally often a good thing. It can be abused by all religions, including ours, right? Absolutely. And I don't, just in the same way that I don't like extremism in politics, I don't like extremism in religion either, right? But I do think that the precepts of helping other people, like, have you seen that? I'm sure they don't run in Israel, but in the U.S. for the past couple of years, there have been these Jesus ads on TV that are brilliant. You got to watch them on YouTube.
I wasn't targeted with them, I guess. I don't know.
You weren't the target, right? They are absolutely brilliant ads. But the point of the ad is Jesus's fundamental view was to help other people in need, right? That is the point of Christianity. That's great, right? Like, I think that is, I love seeing those ads because that's what we should be doing, which is helping our fellow human beings. And so to me, much in the same way that I believe that I support, this would be sort of a more right-wing view that I hold, government funding of religious institutions to provide social services. So, for example, every Thursday, I volunteer at an Episcopal church called St. George's on 16th Street, 2nd and 3rd, at a soup kitchen that we run called Common Table. It's not government funded. In fact, it's Bradley funded. But fundamentally, like, there'd be nothing wrong if we received government funding to help people, because every Thursday around 100 people come and we feed them, right? And that is a good thing. And if churches and synagogues and mosques and others can perform social services and help people, we should do that. And if we could take the views that are fundamental to all these religions that are about helping your fellow person, being a good human being, and get them out there more widely, what I was trying to do was make it possible to attend religious services online anywhere in the world. I failed in my attempt to do so, but I still think the underlying idea has some merit to it. I think we would be a much better society and a much better place. And so, I do think that theology has an important role to play in society. And I recognize that progressive Americans who are listening to this would object strenuously to it. That's okay. The only view that I believe I'm responsible to is my own and my own morality. But yeah, that's how I see it.
Thank you, Bradley. I encourage everyone, because I think it's a provoking read, to read Vote with Your Phone, Why Mobile Voting is Our Final Shot at Saving Democracy. Saving democracy is something I think a lot about right now. I think our politicians have gone completely off the rails. We're dysfunctional at this point. And I think Bradley's suggestion of making sure we get to more and more people as a way to kind of center us as a population is a fascinating thing. I think time will tell whether it plays out that way. Bradley's also the author of Obvious in Hindsight and The Fixer. I encourage you to read those books as well. And if you want to follow Bradley Tusk, you can find him on X at BradleyTusk.
So find me on LinkedIn.
Find Bradley. I was just going to say almost no followers on X. That was going to be my next comment.
Yeah, we're not on X, but find us on LinkedIn, and if you go to BradleyTusk.com, you can sign up for my Substack, for my podcast Firewall, and for those of you who are in New York City or visiting New York City, if you like books, I own a bookstore on the Lower East Side called P&T Knitwear.
I was just covering that.
Street, so stop by and check us out.
P&T Knitwear is a really cool initiative by Bradley, who's himself a fascinating person taking on many of society's challenges. So thank you, Bradley. Appreciate you being here. That was a great conversation.